Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode with Coach, the Professional podcast with me, your host, Teresa Brooks. And this is a guest today that I have wanted to have on for quite a while, and we have connected on the socials. We've talked about lots of things. I've seen her on lots of different threads, and I think this is a perfect example of the influence that we can have online. When we see people, we make connections with people, but we don't know who they are, but we're certainly noticing what they do, the work they do. And as a result of all of that, I've invited the lovely Ali Smith to come on to the podcast today and talk to us. And Ali is a trauma-informed coach, speaker, and trainer. She works both with corporates and with online coaches. And today we are going to dig into some really interesting but necessary conversations around the online space and trauma. So welcome, Ali. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yes, excited to have you here. And this is, a subject which, we were just talking off air that we're not going to shy away from digging into what's important about today, because it can be one of those subjects where people will cringe or shy away just slightly, even with the mention of the word trauma. So to sort of lay the scene, the landscape, if you like, for our conversation, do you want to just share a little bit about your story, Ali, and how you got involved in this work and what happened to you?
Sure. So basically, I was involved in a terrorist attack in my 20s. That was then followed 2 years later by the suicide of my best friend. And a couple of years after that, we experienced a horrific death in my family, where my brother was brutally killed as well. So I grew up in a family, Teresa, where we were kind of taught that, when bad things happen, you just soldier on, you just move on, you kind of brush things under the carpet, and, you just deal with it. You just kind of man up and deal with it. And back in those days, the word trauma was never mentioned. Like the word PTSD was never mentioned, right? Like you just didn't talk about that. So for years after, I kind of had the 6-year period where obviously I became very emotionally dysregulated. I had extreme, I would call it maladaptive stress response. I felt afraid a lot of the time. And I didn't realize for a long time afterwards that I was actually suffering from PTSD. Now, like I say, so in those days, makes me sound really old, but, in those days, there were lots of therapists at hand to help, etc. I had psychotherapy. I went to see my GP, but there wasn't really that awareness around PTSD. And, when you work with someone with PTSD, it's a very different approach to, just normal sort of talk therapy. So for a long time, I suffered with PTSD, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't really understand what was happening. And it took a long time for me to actually get the help that I needed. It was actually something called EMDR, which is, I'm trained in EMDR now, and I use it with my own clients, but it was something that called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That was actually the therapy that really, really helped me. So I guess because I had that whole history, all those years of experiencing, the hell really that is post-traumatic stress, I think I always knew back then that one day, as cheesy as it sounds, but one day I want to be able to take, what happened to me and be able to use that to help other people. So I think that was where my desire for wanting to work with trauma, or certainly wanting to raise awareness around trauma and PTSD, and sort of helping to educate people and helping to, I would say, debunk the stigma, kind of remove the stigma around that, because I think even now, I think there's a certain sort of stigma around the word post-traumatic stress,
Yeah, I think there is. I think, that still, well, I guess it depends. Let's probably position something. When you say the old days, I mean, you know, I'm sitting here looking at Ali and she's definitely not old. So we're probably going back to, like, you know, the 80s, really, sort of 70s, 80s time. I mean, I grew up through the 80s, and we would think maybe PTSD was somebody from war. You know, that's something like really bad, and we don't really know what it is, but it's not anything I've got, and because I haven't been to war. And so it was attached to certain beliefs around certain frames like that. And of course, absolutely, the help wasn't really there. People didn't talk about trauma, you know, coming from, you know, parents that were post-war babies. There was a huge amount of that, you know, you could call it resilience, but also soldiering on is what you said. And that, I heard a lot of that in my childhood. You know, we'll just soldier on. What can you do? It's, you know, almost no pathways. And so I'm sorry to hear that you experienced those huge traumas in your life, and certainly the way you've listed those out, they are three big ones, you know, which most people wouldn't experience one in a lifetime. And I think that's interesting just to unpack, if you wouldn't mind, Ali, because I think a lot of people may think, well, I haven't had any trauma. Like, wow, listen to Ali say that, and gosh, that's awful, and I haven't even had one of those, so I don't have any trauma.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, when I started learning about trauma, and when I sort of started studying it, if you look at the real definition of trauma, trauma isn't about the event. Probably people that are listening to this podcast would have heard of Dr. Gabor Mate. And in Dr. Gabor Mate's words, trauma is not about the event, it's about the process, the internal process that happens as a result of the event. And again, I think people now are becoming a lot more aware of that. Whereas again, sort of, you know, years ago, they used to talk about big T and little t, you know, big trauma, little trauma. And I think we're even moving away from that now, because, you know, it's really not about the experience, but it's about how your nervous system responds. So essentially, when you become, we talk about nervous system dysregulation, when you become dysregulated in your system, and you will feel it, because that's when you're going to fight, flight, or freeze. That is nervous system dysregulation. So technically, the definition of trauma is anything that causes your nervous system to become dysregulated. And again, Maston Kipp would say, you know, he's a very well-known sort of, he's a life coach, but he specializes in trauma. And he always says the question to ask is not whether I've had trauma, but whether I am emotionally dysregulated, like how dysregulated am I in my nervous system? So I think when we look at trauma from that perspective, that is essentially what trauma is. So the way I see it, like, everybody will experience or has experienced some version of trauma in their life. But what's traumatic for me, Teresa, may not be traumatic for you, and vice versa.
Yes, exactly. So, and, you know, thank you for unpacking that, because I do think, and again, we've got a problem in there, haven't we, Houston? Because we've got the language of what you're talking about, maybe the old way, let's just call it that. So the big T and the little t. So big T is what you've been through. Little t might be me being shouted at by the teacher at school, and it really made me feel so bad that I kind of never forgot it. Or anything even smaller than that, or seemingly insignificant in terms of how you would describe an event. And the thing is, I think people, it's the education piece that you're giving there that's so useful and needed, because people will still think, oh my goodness, I can see that you went through that trauma. I can see if you survived 9/11, trauma, a plane crash, a rape, an abuse, trauma. People are still understanding it in those ways. Therefore, are they not minimizing any other trauma that they've had? Or they're thinking that it's just not irrelevant, it's not important, they don't know what emotional dysregulation actually is. And in basic terms, if we translate what you said, it's stress, it's how you feel, it's how your body's responding, it's anxiety, it's whatever it might be, where you're having a somatic body response, right? So I think, how do you approach starting to educate the masses, because I think when that word is still seen, Ali, and it's in a post or it's on a blog or whatever, a lot of people are starting to realize, you know, my trauma, my experience, what I've made it mean. You know, I'm still thinking about this because this is what I've made it mean. And this is how I filtered it and processed it. Someone else in the same experience, not at all, like you rightly said. So what's the education that, you know, you can bring and that we can bring to help that kind of transition, so that it's not minimizing trauma, but it's almost like we need a new word. You know what I mean?
We
it's
do,
like,
absolutely. And I think what's interesting is that we have gone from, you know, the good old days, so to speak, where we didn't talk about trauma, to now where so many people are becoming hashtag trauma informed, you know, and it's kind of trendy to use that term. I'm hashtag trauma informed, which is great, but it's almost like we need to, I think, so I run trauma awareness workshops because I'm passionate about just raising awareness. But I think it's important that people understand the difference between stress and trauma. Like stress is a little bit of stress in our daily life is actually good. It's healthy.
Needed.
When it's needed, when it's predictable and when it's measured, then it builds resilience. Okay.
Absolutely
agree. But when stress is unpredictable and when it's extreme and when it sort of comes from nowhere, then that could be defined as trauma. So again, it comes back to how that's impacting your nervous system.
So maybe that will help some listeners to think, that's interesting. So maybe when I feel, I mean, a good word to use there perhaps is, you know, another term, but triggered, when like you're suddenly triggered by something and it really sets off a response in you, whether it be mental, physical, or combined, or anything energetically, something like that. What if people can't attach it or connect the dots to anything obvious? Because then that goes back to the, okay, I don't think I've got any trauma because I didn't experience anything like that. How can people start to follow that trail a little, do you think?
That's a great question, actually. And I guess if you look at the different types of trauma, you know, you've got childhood trauma, and there again, the experts will talk about implicit and explicit memories. So there may be something in your childhood that could have been traumatic that you don't actually remember at a conscious level. So again, I think, you know, and then you have like vicarious trauma, which is something you may not have experienced yourself, but it may be something like, for example, what we're experiencing now, the war in Ukraine, that is vicarious trauma, because we're all feeling it in our nervous system, even though it's not happening to me physically, I still feel it. So that is, you know, there are so many different types of trauma. I think it all comes down to, you asked how somebody sort of follows the trail, so to speak. I think it starts with learning about your nervous system. I work with something called polyvagal theory, which is all about how your nervous system responds, and just learning how to work with your nervous system, to understand it, and to manage those triggers when they come up from a nervous system at the level of your nervous system, if that makes sense.
So you mean literally physically, understanding your body and the messages that your body is giving to you, and I guess it's not, sometimes we wouldn't question that so much. You know, some people might not question the body responses, they just get ignored, a little bit like some thoughts that we have, and it's like, oh, I'll be okay, or I'll be all right once I've got past this thing, I won't feel anxious anymore, instead of any inquiry around, well, why does this make me feel so anxious? You know, where does that come from? So like you're saying, it's becoming aware, and it's also, I think, you know, let me know if you agree, a little bit of self-inquiry, and that, I mean, self-awareness is everything. It's where we start as coaches, and we never stop from that, do we? It's like, how can we be more aware?
So if something's triggering me, I would ask myself, first of all, what's happening in my body? Because our body always responds through sensations. You know, Peter Levine says that sensations, he founded something called somatic experiencing, which is amazing trauma therapy, but he always says sensations are actually stored emotion. So start by, I always tell my clients, connect to your body, connect to how you're feeling, what sensations are coming up, what are the emotions connected to that, and then you can begin to it's about becoming curious about your triggers. But really working to get that balance in your nervous system first, so that you feel safe enough to begin to ask the questions. Okay, what was it? Was there something that actually happened to me that I haven't fully processed? Because it's all about establishing that safety first, before you can begin to explore a little bit more.
I love that. And so also what I'm hearing from that is like, just slow down a bit, like when we're at high speed, we don't notice things in our bodies that are going on. This is why we don't notice when we get to burnout. It's like, I thought it was okay, but of course there would have been many, many signs along the way. So hopefully that helps anyone that's listening to start thinking about where may I be dysregulated, and maybe this symptom or that experience or that feeling isn't as normal as I think. I mean, if everybody else doesn't have it, then it's my thing, right? And so maybe they can explore that a little bit from there. You mentioned triggers. Let's move on to the coaching industry and triggers and trauma. And I put those three together in a trifecta of hell, perhaps. Amazing conversation this is going to be, right? We've set it up now, haven't we, Ali? So coaching triggers and trauma, because as coaches we want to help people. We are here as solution focused, well-intentioned souls, helpers who just want to do our best job. And the majority of us will invest in our training. We'll do our best. We will fail, we'll succeed, we'll fall, we'll always be aware, but we're keeping going. And that's what this podcast and my community is all about. Not being perfect and not preaching, but saying these are really some of the standards and the baselines that you need to have. Now, of course, that's just an opinion, because the industry is not regulated and we don't need to do anything. So anybody who's not training as a coach, not doing anything wrong. There's absolutely nowhere, no police being called. They're not doing anything wrong. However, there's a lot of impact with it. And I'm not saying, just a caveat, I'm not saying that trained coaching is the be all and end all, and that once you've done your training, you're going to be this incredible human being who won't need to do anything else. And it's fine. I'm honestly not saying that either, because I don't want to sound preachy. But what I am saying is that we need if we have no regulation, then we need to self-regulate, right? And if we do that as a collective with shared values and unity, then hopefully that message will permeate out, radiate out for good. So the reason I put those things together is because there's a lot of talk about trauma online at the moment. There's a lot of talk about trauma informed as a language. And there's also a lot of projection around this. I'm going to say there's a lot of projection coming out. You should do this. And if you're not doing that, and if you don't know this and you don't know that, then you shouldn't be doing that. And it just all pours out. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I know it's on people's lips and I know it's in their minds, but I know not everybody says it. But I'm wondering whether the trauma triggers and everything is just going around like a bit of wildfire, and it's also quite unregulated in the way that people are managing it and using it in the coaching industry. What do you think?
I completely
Over to Ali.
Where do I start? Where do I start with all of this?
Just what comes up for you first with that, really. Let's just get a feel.
I think the word trauma is definitely being overused online. I think it's and it's interesting because I'm helping people to become more trauma informed. It's one of the things I do. So I think being trauma aware and trauma informed is important. But what I don't like is when people use it as you rightly said, Teresa, as almost as a sales technique to get people to buy into their programs. Yeah, I would say from what I've seen, there's been a big rise of narcissism online. And I know this is something that a lot of the experts are talking about, people like Richard Grannon. There's almost this, with narcissism comes codependency as well. So they're almost people that feel obliged to follow particular individuals and almost made to feel like they're doing something wrong if they're not.
Yes.
Like if you don't buy this amazing program, like it'll be your fault if you don't go on and make millions, or whatever. And there's lots of gaslighting that goes along with that, making people feel like they're doing something wrong if they don't go along with all of that, and lots of manipulation, really, I think.
Which is ironic, is it not? So the thing is, if we go back a few steps, what you just said there, none of us like shoddy sales techniques, okay? And sales pathways of the past, I call them, and I know because I've been trained in all of those. My 20 years in sales I've had all the training that you could have around sales. So and I can really see and understand how people could misuse it.
Yeah.
The skills and techniques, because what the skills and techniques of sales are around communication, are around understanding, are around extracting the knowledge and finding the needs of people. Now, of course, if you start to learn to do that really well, you are going to be able to tweak it, manipulate it, change it, reshape it to get what you want. And then we're starting to fall into the land of the narcissist, really. And so there's, just to say that, let's get a little frame around how trauma is kind of used online in those shapes at the moment from your perspective. And the reason that I ask you is because you are a trauma-informed coach, so you're not speaking out against that, you are supporting that, but also we're trying to highlight to our communities and our people and our future clients the pitfalls, really, of this. And we talked a little bit off camera about trauma in people being unpacked in order to invite that problem and then solve it with an incredibly potent and probably over the top container trauma for an awful lot of money, where perhaps people didn't even realize they had or were experiencing any trauma to start with. And so this can be really quite damaging.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I know something that I felt quite strongly about over the last couple of years. I was seeing people making claims that, if you sign up for this amazing therapy, it's going to heal all your trauma in 1 or 2 sessions, making bold claims like that. And I've seen a lot of that. With all sorts of different therapies, making claims that this will cure all your trauma. And I think people have got to be really, really careful with that.
So let's just ask a question around that. Is that possible? Like, say, for instance, I mean, you're an NLP trained as well. If you believe that's possible when you go through a process and you feel different and you feel better, has that happened or has that not happened? Is that okay or is that not okay?
I think if it works for someone and they feel better, again, it all comes down to feeling. Do you feel regulated in your nervous system? Does that thing that happened to you 5 years ago still bother you? Is that memory still replaying in your mind? Those are all the questions to ask. So I'm not saying that for some people that's not going to work, because if they really believe it, perhaps it will work. But for people where it doesn't happen,
which is more likely.
People where it doesn't happen, they then going to be left feeling, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me, like,
or worse than they went in.
Absolutely, or feel completely worse. So there's always going to be context with the word trauma, or if someone has experienced trauma, there's always going to be context in that,
of course,
and there's always going to be nuance. And I think people need to realize that you can't just say, oh, you have trauma and it's going to look like this and this and this. No, it's going to, everyone, there's a lot that we don't know about the brain. There's a lot we still don't know about trauma. We don't know it all.
Absolutely not. And I think if we come from a position of knowing nothing, then we can learn a little bit more, because a little knowledge is dangerous, as they say. And once we get a bit more experience in our crafts, sometimes that can get in our way from, examining subject like this or looking at it a bit closer. You mentioned Peter Levine, and I've done one of his trauma training courses. I think that's something we talked about actually in the community.
Yeah.
And I love the way that he teaches through nature and through obviously how animals somatically respond, and how they recoup as well, and how they carry on, because obviously they don't have language. So they're missing that, and yet they find their ways through it, which I find absolutely fascinating. So we have the gift of language, but still that's not always enough, because there are not enough words really with our basic vowels and consonants that we have sometimes to express how we're feeling. And you've probably been in many situations like that, and that's where I think that somatic part is just so important.
Somatic part is everything. It's literally everything. We also, as human beings, we have a rational brain which sometimes gets in the way,
always,
like yeah, exactly. Like animals know how to complete that stress cycle.
And it's incredible.
It's amazing. If you're familiar with Peter's work, he always talks about the analogy of the impala being chased by the lion and all of that.
That's it. The collapse,
the freeze, the fake death, where it actually goes into freeze response, but then it'll shake afterwards, and it's actually releasing all that stored adrenaline, which is that fight flight energy. We as humans, we don't do that. We don't allow ourselves to come out of that stress response. And also we live in a society that encourages that. We live in a high stress environment, every single day. It's all about work and, go. So
it's very contracted, isn't it? And I remember also reading about dogs, and I never looked at my dog the same again, because dogs, I don't know if you've got a dog, but you go dog walking. And,
I have a cat.
Okay, so when you go dog walking, there's always little roofs, little situations, and my dog suddenly thinks that he's a Rottweiler, and he'll hackle up and take something on, and they have this little moment, and then it's over. And as he walks away, he shakes it off, and then he carries on to the next stick, tree, whatever. And he doesn't come home thinking about that dog, what that dog's in. It's all gone, because he doesn't have that mind, like you say. And so every time I see him do that, it reminds me to use my body. And in our coach training, it was very somatic. We did a lot of shaking and physical movement of literally shaking it off, and I felt so stupid. I was like, this feels really uncomfortable for me. Why am I doing? I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. But I really wasn't into it. And it's not until I got further into the awareness and the training that I've realized the power of moving my own body and what I can do with it, and when it becomes very contracted, and then how I'll be even physically in pain sometimes because we don't move enough. So it's super interesting, and we slightly digress there just because I think it's important to unpack what is going on with traumatic responses, because then people can interpret it into their own world and landscape.
Definitely.
Let's kind of like slide back into coaching, Ali. How does being trauma informed make you a better coach? Is the first question. The second question is, what level of trauma informed do you need to be that better coach?
Again, great questions. I think first of all, it just gives you, being trauma informed as a coach is going to give you huge self-awareness about your own responses, and how you react to other people, I think. So I always say to people, if you have a team, or if you head up a mastermind or anything like that, being aware of how everyone that you influence is kind of responding or not responding. Having trauma awareness will really help you to be a lot more aware with that, I think. And it's about improved collaboration, improved productivity, really, in the corporate world, especially if you look at the number of people that go off work with stress. I know I have a corporate background as well, and back in the day when I was working in the corporate world, I went off with stress a couple of times, and who didn't? Exactly.
It's easier.
I just remember how that was, how like the HR managers and managers in the company actually responded to that. And looking back now, I think, my gosh, there was a huge lack of awareness around all of that.
Massive.
I remember at the time I had medical aid through the company that I worked for, but the medical aid only covered it didn't cover anything to do with mental health. So like if you had stress or post-traumatic stress or whatever, you were just like booked off by the doctor, but there was no kind of support from your company and all of that, you know.
No, and I remember that. I remember people going off with stress, and you'd be like, what's wrong with them? You know, you just really, there was that vibe that there was something wrong, and like
that
when
taboo,
they came back,
right?
Yeah, that taboo. And when they came back, you're right, like, can we talk to you? Is everything fine? Like, what, you know, people just didn't know what to do around that, or anyone that was struggling or suffering. And so as a result, many people would keep that internalized, and of course that causes so many problems. And like you're saying, and it still happens now. But when we talk about, so I love that it's like it will help you to lead better. Absolutely. You know, run your groups better, know who's responding, and very rightly so, who's not responding and why. Can you give us a few specifics about how that would improve that leadership? Say, for instance, you're a coach and you're running a group or a mastermind, and you're leading with your own energy, and you're not trauma informed per se. We don't know anything about it. It's just not really your bag. Haven't really done anything around that. You're just doing what you do. What are the pitfalls? Where could you fall up and trip up in that space, Ali?
So I actually run a workshop which is around the 4F stress response. Yes. I don't know if you've heard of the 4F stress response. You have fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Now, there's a guy called Pete Walker who's an American therapist who talks a lot about the 4F stress response. Most of us have got a default. So if you're a fighter, fight's going to be your stress response default. Potentially that means you may become really controlling, you may become like really angry when you are as a leader, when you are triggered. So again, if you're running a mastermind or a business and you are a fighter, or you may be a flighter, which means that's your stress default, which means you go into perfectionism mode, you know, everything has to be perfect, and you may project that onto your team. So being trauma informed, being stress informed is about having that awareness about how you respond when you're under pressure, right? And how that's going to impact the rest of your team. Someone who goes into freeze, like my stress default I was always very much a fawn freeze, which means that if I was stressed out or triggered, I would just go into freeze, which is where you just literally shut down, procrastinate, like all the tasks that you have to do will build up, but I'll be in freeze. So it just means I just have no energy. I just feel like I can't do anything. You know, understanding how we respond when we're stressed, I think is hugely beneficial to just being able to change how you respond to your team members and adapt your personality in that instance.
Absolutely. Super high value. What about so freeze was a little bit of your response, Ali. You shared that. Thank you for sharing. What about fawn? You want to just unpack what fawn is?
Yeah. So a few people may not know what fawn response is. A fawn response is a phrase that was coined by Pete Walker, and this is all around people pleasing, appeasing, negotiating. So if you, for example, grew up in a family where there may have been trauma, where you may have had quite an authoritarian, aggressive parent, and you may have been quite hyper-adrenalized as a child because there was fear there, you may have adopted what we call the fawn response, which is basically, I need to really be really lovely and nice and people please and
make it okay
and negotiate my way out of that stress response, right? So it's a way of protecting yourself.
I think that just that little bit there, explaining that, I'm sure that anyone listening will go, maybe that's me. Maybe I do need to look at this stuff. And so the question is, you know, if you want to be a good leader and you want to be a good coach, this then leads me to talk about, well, this is about how this may affect our clients and our groups and the people that we have influence on and are leading with well intention. So we must focus on our own stuff. And I think, you know, any coach knows that is part of it. I've got to be honest, when I came into the coaching space, I wasn't expecting to do anything like that. Well, truly, I wasn't. And I work with a lot of new coaches, and I know that they're not either, because that isn't really addressed so much in coach training, which is something I want to change when I start my coach training, because they're quite surprised at what comes up for them whilst they're coaching other people. And this is a learning curve, which I think is super important, because, you know, I work quite energetically as well. And I notice now much more of a rhythm. It's like my clients are in sync with me. They mirror me and I mirror them. So after every session, I'm like, whoa, I can see a lot more, excuse me, than I could see before. So yes, they're bringing to me and I'm coaching them, but that gives me stuff to go away with out of the coaching session, because I can see the mirror. And so I can think, oh, right, what was going on today? And so nothing bad will have happened in my space, but it gives me that information and that reflection to go out and to work on that, which is so important, right?
Massively. It's interesting you talk about that mirroring, because in polyvagal theory we talk about regulation, so how you can regulate yourself, but there's also co-regulation, so we can co-regulate, like my nervous system co-regulating with your nervous system. And again, you're talking about when you work with your own clients. When I work with my clients, I get that as well. Like if someone's super stressed, I have to make sure I'm really grounded and I'm calm. And then I may tilt my head to the one side, drop the tone of my voice. That helps them then to regulate. And so you get that mirroring, and that you're talking about that kind of transfer of energy, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's beautiful, really. I mean, this is why coaching is so beautiful. And of course, in NLP, that, you know, we would then just call that calibration. You're pacing a client. So you pace with them until you can then lead them. If someone's all stressed and then you're like, oh my God, they're all stressed, and now I'm all stressed, and then we're all stressed and we're having this really stressful coaching session. Like, who wants to pay for that? So, you know, again, it's noticing how you show up, isn't it? To the space before you come, you know, and what's going on. And if stuff is going on, because let's be honest, Ali, we are humans, we're coaches, we're not perfect, we have stuff going on. You know, we have difficult things going on. We have trauma going on in our lives, possibly, at all levels. So we need to be able to do the animal thing, really. We need to be able to shake that off and change state. And that's what I lean into a lot, so that, you know, the boundaries can then come as well. So my stuff is there. I know it's there, but I am here and I'm good. And that's what I work on. Having worked through, I've experienced what we might call like big trauma in my life, but I don't bring that into my work right now. But I have definitely learned a huge amount around it because of it, and still am. But I notice I don't respond in all the ways that other people do, because I've had some pretty good self-regulation going on over the years that I just wasn't aware of. But now I am more aware of it. So I just really want to invite people to think about this today, so that they can become aware themselves and not think that everyone is trying to just map on trauma to them, which feels quite heavy, and I haven't got any.
I do think it comes down to self-awareness and knowing what you can do to regulate yourself, and that's going to be different for everyone. Like for me, I love yoga, I love Pilates, I love sometimes it's about shaking it off, right? It's not always about relaxing. Sometimes you've got that adrenaline that you need to get rid of as well. So it's just about knowing what works for you, so that you can
following your instinct as well, isn't it? Because sometimes I do think if there was a fly on the wall camera in my kitchen, my clients would be like, I'm not sure if I want to work with Teresa anymore, because I will literally go into the kitchen and just go literally crazy for a few minutes, like energetically skip and dance. We might put the radio on, and just go a bit nuts. And sometimes my daughter's like, Mum, what are you doing? I'm all right, I'm just like letting it out. Do you know what I mean? And that just kind of sets my state. Other times it might be on the yoga mat, or just sitting for 10 minutes and just silence, really. And I've learned personally to tune into myself a lot more than I ever did. So it's never about judgment, because we're all on our journeys at the point that we're at. But I think one of the questions was, how trauma aware do you need to be? Because listen, there's programs and there's courses that might range from some of the investments I've made around trauma informed, some of Peter Levine's work is really accessible, you know, like it's totally affordable. So a new coach or someone without a client or someone that's just interested could absolutely get into that. There's other ones that are months and months long and thousands of pounds. And I think what I want to just get your opinion on here, Ali, is that coaches are out there and they kind of want to be trauma informed and understand a bit about this, but they don't want to spend thousands. And indeed, do they need to, depending on what, does everybody need to? Does it matter in your niche? What do you think?
Depends who you want to work with and how you want to market yourself. I mean, if you market yourself as a trauma coach, then yes, you need to have a proper trauma certification, because you need to be insured as well and accredited. That's all really, really important. But if you're if you're a business coach or a life coach and you have a sort of a different niche, then you don't need to. I don't think you need to go and pay thousands to have another certification. But I think being aware, having a level of awareness around just what trauma is and what nervous system regulation is, because that's what it comes down to, is important. But you can, you know, this is one of the reasons why I offer trauma awareness workshops, because I kind of wanted to plug that gap between you know, having to go and pay thousands on another certification, which you may not need because you may not be working with traumatized people. So just being able to plug that gap, just being able to give people that awareness and that education without, as I say, having to go and do another certification that they probably don't need anyway.
Is enough. And I suppose if you really enjoy that, and of course you want to take it further, you can, but it's about having that sort of entry point, isn't it? You know, that entry level, and then where you can take it from there. Okay, thanks, Ali. One thing I just wanted to touch on, it goes back probably a little bit before we wrap up the podcast today. You talked about narcissism online. There's a couple of phrases that we kind of touched on, but just to understand what they might mean in terms of coaches, clients, people out there in the online space that are unaware. You talked about gaslighting.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit more about that in this context of like what that means if we may feel that we're being that form that is being used on us, or how we could recognize that?
So gaslighting is really a tactic that is used. It's a form of manipulation that's used to make you doubt your own reality. So, you know, this is something that'll happen in abusive relationships where so your partner may say something. Let's say, for example, your partner says something abusive to you, and then you may bring that up later, and he may say that I never said that, or you lying about that. So it makes you doubt your own reality, and you begin to question whether how you feel or what you think is actually valid. And
can that happen online in terms of reading posts and blogs, and how do we get gaslit online?
I would say we get gaslit online by sales talk that makes us believe that if we don't buy a certain program, we're not going to be successful, or it's not going to work for us, or just kind of that manipulative speak, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it's so subtle sometimes, isn't it, that we've just got to be very, very aware, and by building our own awareness we then learn to spot these things a bit more. So the other phrase as well was and this is coming out quite a lot, of like shaming people, and I think that relates to what you've just said there. So like, well, you know, if you don't do this, well, this is, you know, really bad for you, and what, you can't afford that, so oh dear, well maybe you could borrow the money, or maybe it could do, and it's like forcing
put it on your credit card. Because
seriously, you can't afford that, but you think that you've got a business and you're a coach, and really, and so it's all of that conversation, which is absolutely shocking. And you know, I would really call myself an expert in sales communication, and I had a call a long time ago now with somebody who's super good, like really, really good. And in fact, so much so I was like, this is a great sales call. And I was looking at all the good quality pieces in there, you know, the conversation that was really beautiful and artful. But there was a lot of empathy missing, a lot of compassion missing. And when it came to the huge tag, Ali, at the end, I was quite comfortable to say no. And no thanks. And then it kind of pursued a little after that into, well, how could you get the money together? So, well, I can't. I've already said that. Yeah. And so it kind of went like that. And there was a few calls after that then, didn't shake me from my post. But I remember feeling, I remember feeling a bit, oh God, I can't come up with that. Maybe I should be able to just come up with that, and maybe just pay all these figures, thousands and thousands of pounds, just like that. And that's somebody who, that's me, who I consider myself quite confident, know about sales, I stand my ground, got good boundaries. And I started feeling a bit uncomfortable around that. So I can only imagine.
So you felt that shame, that you were being shamed into.
I could feel that coming. Yeah. I mean, I managed to override that. I was like, no, but it did sort of comes over you like a horrible shadow. It was like, oh God, I should be able to get, all these thousands of pounds just instantly. And if I don't, then I'm not serious about my business, like all of that stuff. And I was like, forget it, just forget that. But I did feel it. And so I can't imagine the pain. And I know the pain because I hear the stories of some people that they go through when they felt that, and they've said yes, and they've gone for it. And then they're either in debt or they're struggling. It's not the right thing. They don't get what they wanted.
It's happened to me. I bought programs that I didn't need. I really didn't need. God. And then you end up thinking, why did I buy that? I bought that because I was sold the FOMO and the fear that if I don't do it, I have to do it because I'm a coach and you've got to invest. And it's like, yes, but what, it's about looking at where you are in your business. What do you actually need? If you're in your first year, you probably need to be focusing on sales and marketing, and that's it.
100%.
Like the rest of the stuff can come later.
Yeah.
But that's not what happens online typically. It's like, all the marketing is so good, and it's like you are being almost sort of coerced into buying stuff that you don't actually need at that particular time. So yeah.
So if that's ever happened to you, or anyone that it's happened to us, anyone that's listening, then would you say, Ali, that that's potentially a sign of trauma within you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, you're being ripped off, right?
But you feel like, if you imagine that fawn response, oh my God, this is quite stressful. This person asking me for a lot of money, I don't know what to do. But and that pleasing comes in, and that
codependency.
And that negotiating your way out of that situation means I will just find the money and do it, and I don't say no, and I'm going to do it. That's trauma. So these people are actually triggering trauma in that way, and that I do agree with. I can see that, and so it's a very intricate pattern, isn't it? But ultimately, It's quite simple. You run with integrity. You follow the ethics of your training, and you notice when someone is suffering in a way or talking about things that really are not in your remit. And I've got a couple of clients that are, seeing counsellors and therapists as well as working with me. And that's working really nicely. And I've suggested it as well. And if it turned out that I'm going to go and have counselling or therapy, and I'm going to stop my coaching here for a while, then so be it. Because that's the right thing to do. So
I think it's important to have your own personal boundaries in all of this. And not just to be swept away by the online world and whoever the latest sort of gurus are, thinking I've got to follow this person because they've got thousands and thousands of followers and then they're making millions and all of that. No, it's like listen to your intuition. I always listen to my intuition, and have your own boundaries in place and know what it is that your business actually needs at this point in time. And you don't have to codependently just follow all these people and buy all their programs just because that's your default, the sign. Right?
That's another sign of trauma as well, isn't it? So it's like, whoa, let me just step back and see what I actually need, because I would say that everyone's worthy, whether they've come out of the corporate, they're going into coaching space, whether they're just looking for their first client or they've got 20 million clients, everyone's just as worthy. But the whole money measure, the success, it's all becoming a little intense, I think. And I think we need to remember that as humans, we're equally worthy wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whatever our circumstances are. Because for my heart goes out sometimes to the early coaches, the new coaches that I work with, because they're like, God, all this stuff online, and I just want a client, you know. I've done all
Yeah.
this training, and that's what I help them to get. I help them to get their first clients, and that takes a bit of time and the confidence, and other things come up during that. And I say, don't look at everything. You know, some of them don't even want to post because they're like, oh, I just don't want to. I look so stupid. I haven't made 1 million. I haven't made 6 figures. I haven't done anything yet. Who am I to talk and speak up? And that, I think, is a very dangerous landscape. And so I would love to just highlight that before we wrap up, that, you know, we're worthy of a seat at the table.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's not all about Facebook and social media. Like, I get a lot of my clients from Google. I've run Google ads before, and it's worked really well for me. So I get referrals from people. So it's not all about, you know, making it on Facebook. Like,
I think that's one of the most positive, exciting areas, but it's also one of the most damaging areas as well. And you hear lots of people moving away. And of course, there's plenty of ways. Like, how did anyone ever get business? I mean, you know, most of mine is through networking and referrals. And yes, I do use a lot of social media, but it's really a little bit more with me, the old-fashioned routes, you know, through people. And networking, that's what's always worked for me. And so I leverage relationships like a lot, you know, because that's what we're building. But thank you, Ali. We've unpacked an awful lot there. And I think that, you know, whoever is listening, I hope that you've had your buck's worth there on your walk, or whilst you're tidying your kitchen, or on your bike, or whatever you're doing. And thank you for joining us. And I hope that you've had a little insight into not only your own traumatic responses potentially, but thinking about your body, your nervous system, how you work, thinking about how you can impact your clients and serve at your best, and what you might need that would help you to move forward and become more aware in this area. And thank you, Ali, for being the expert guide on that, and for having, you know, a really open conversation with me in this space. So if people want to find out a little bit more, where can they find you?
So where can they find me? I have a website, which is www.ali-smith.com. So come and join me there. There's loads of resources on my website, and it would be great to connect.
Lovely. And then you can find out about Ali's workshops there and everything else that she has got on offer. And if you go to coach-magazine.com, you can subscribe as well, and make sure that you receive all these latest podcasts and the articles. And there's a chance that you can actually submit as well to be published in Coach and to feature on the podcast. And if you want to talk to me about anything, then I'm pretty easy to contact also. So thanks once again, Ali. Pleasure. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Teresa. Speak to you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.